August 26, 1346. In a soggy field near Crecy, France, 9,000 weary English soldiers prepared to face 30,000 of Europe's elite knights. The French had every advantage: greater numbers, heavily armored cavalry, and the continent's most prestigious nobility. Their confidence was so high that French lords argued over who would have the honor of killing the English king. 4 hours later, 1,500 French nobles lay dead, princes, dukes, and even kings. The English had lost only 40 men, not 400, 40. In a single afternoon, 500 years of knightly supremacy came to an end, toppled by peasants armed with nothing more than sticks and strings. The blind king of Bohemia charged straight into the slaughter, refusing to stay behind. French knights, in their panic, trampled their own comrades while fleeing. Genoese crossbowmen were slaughtered by the very French nobles who had hired them. And for weeks, crows feasted on the noble corpses until they were too fat to fly. This was the Battle of Crécy, a place where medieval warfare died in the mud, where the idea of nobility earned through combat was shattered by common-born archers, and where the 100 Years' War began with France's most humiliating defeat. By the end of this video, you'll see how a weapon costing just 10 shillings could destroy armor worth $1,000, why French knights slaughtered their own mercenaries mid-battle, and how one blind king's suicidal charge became one of history's most gloriously noble deaths. Let's set the stage for this massacre. Edward III of England had just landed in Normandy with roughly 15,000 men, claiming the French crown through his mother. He had been laying waste to northern France in a campaign known as a chevauchée, basically licensed vandalism designed to prove the French king couldn't protect his people. The English had just looted Caen and were trying to escape to English-held Calais when the French army finally caught them. Philip VI of France had assembled the largest army in Christendom. We're talking 30,000 to 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights in full plate armor on armored horses. These weren't just soldiers. This was every important noble in France, plus allied kings and princes from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent troops. The King of Bohemia came with his entire court. Marca sent knights. It was like a medieval Avengers assembly. And they all wanted English blood. The French knights were the tanks of medieval warfare. A fully armored knight on an armored horse weighed about a ton. They'd been bred for war since childhood, trained in combat since they could walk. Their armor cost more than a peasant village earned in a lifetime. For 500 years, heavy cavalry charges had decided European battles. Infantry existed to be trampled. Archers were annoyances. Real men, noble men, fought with swords on horseback. Edward III knew he was doomed, outnumbered 3-1, exhausted from weeks of raiding, low on supplies. But he had something the French didn't respect: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen, mostly peasants and criminals who'd been practicing with their bows since childhood because English law required it. Every Sunday after church, English males had to practice archery. It was literally illegal to play other sports if you could be practicing with a bow. The longbow was a simple weapon, a 6 ft piece of wood. Nothing fancy, but in trained hands it was devastating. These archers could put 12 arrows per minute into a target at 250 yards. That's an arrow every 5 seconds accurately at the distance of 2.5 football fields. The draw weight was so heavy, 150 to 180 libelle, that archaeologists can identify longbow archers by their deformed skeletons. Their left arms were inches longer than their right from years of holding that massive draw weight. Edward positioned his army on a hill near, forcing the French to attack uphill. He arranged his men in 3 divisions with the archers, forming a V-shape between them, creating overlapping fields of fire. Then he did something that shocked both armies. He had his knights dismount and fight on foot. English nobles fighting like common infantry. It was unprecedented. But Edward understood something the French didn't. The age of the mounted knight was ending. Edward's decision to dismount his knights sent shockwaves through his own ranks. These men had trained their whole lives for the thunder of the charge, their war horses worth more than gold. To step down and fight like peasants was an insult to centuries of tradition. But Edward forced the issue, reminding them that survival mattered more than pride. And slowly, knights in polished plate began trudging into the mud beside archers in wool hoods, a sight no one in Crecy had seen before. The English camp was eerily calm the night before the battle. Archers prepared their yew-bows, rubbing beeswax into their strings to keep them dry. Stakes were hammered into the earth and ditches were dug by torchlight. Chronicles say that Edward even had meat and ale distributed, so his men slept with full stomachs while the French army staggered hungry into camp after their forced march. Every detail screamed discipline versus arrogance. The English also prepared the battlefield. They dug ditches and holes in front of their position to break up cavalry charges. They drove sharpened stakes into the ground at angles to impale horses. They turned the terrain into a killing field, while the French were still marching, and then they waited. Meanwhile, on the French side, it was chaos disguised as pageantry. Nobles rode past each other in gleaming armor, banners snapping in the wind, each one more resplendent than the last. Dukes and counts squabbled openly about who would have the honor of leading the charge or of capturing Edward alive for ransom. Some bragged they would bring the English king back in chains before nightfall. Philip VI's attempts to calm his nobles were drowned out by the clamor of trumpets and boasts. The army looked less like a disciplined force and more like a tournament gone mad. When dawn broke on August 26th, the French vanguard had to march through the wreckage of Edward's chevauchée. Villages were still smoking, crops burned, livestock scattered. Peasants whispered curses as they watched thousands of armored knights pass their ruined homes. To the French nobility, this was humiliation that demanded immediate vengeance. To the English, it was proof that their strategy of devastation was working. They had turned the land itself into a weapon. Philip II's army arrived at Crecy around 4:00 p.m. on August 26th, exhausted from a long march. The smart move would have been to rest and attack the next morning. Philip actually ordered a halt, but French nobility didn't do patient. They didn't do tactical. They saw the English on that hill, outnumbered, tired, far from home, and they smelled glory. Every noble wanted to be the one who killed or captured Edward III. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds gathered. A sudden rainstorm soaked the field. The French knights laughed, confident their plate armor would protect them. But the storm meant something very different for missile troops. The English calmly unstrung their bows and tucked the strings under their helmets and cloaks, keeping them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen had no such precaution. Their strings stretched and sagged, useless against the taut yew of the longbow. A tiny detail, a few minutes of foresight, would decide the fate of thousands. When Philip VI finally arrived at the field and saw the English calmly arrayed on the hill, banners fluttering, lines tight, he ordered his army to wait until the next day. But knights don't wait. Behind him, counts and dukes surged forward, shouting that the day was wasting and glory was slipping away. Some had already lowered lances. The king's command dissolved into dust. The French army was no longer an army. It was a mob of impatient aristocrats who refused to let discipline stand in the way of vanity. The Battle of Crécy had begun, not with strategy, but with pride exploding out of control. The French vanguard ignored Philip's orders and began advancing. Once some nobles started forward, others followed, not wanting to miss the glory. The king lost control of his own army before the battle even began. What followed wasn't a battle. It was the aristocratic mob charging to its death. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, about 5,000 of them, the best mercenary missile troops money could buy. But there was a problem. Their pavises, large shields they hid behind while reloading, were still with the baggage train. They'd have to advance without cover. Plus, a brief rainstorm had just passed, and while the English had kept their bowstrings dry under their helmets, the Genoese crossbow strings were wet and stretched, reducing their range. The Genoese advanced, getting into range about 150 yards, and fired a volley. Most bolts fell short. Then the English responded. 5,000 long bows released simultaneously. Witnesses described it as making a sound like thunder. The sky literally darkened with arrows. Each archer was putting out 12 per minute. That's 60,000 arrows per minute falling on the Genoese. The Genoese had no shields, no cover, and their crossbows took 30 seconds to reload versus 5 seconds for a longbow. They were being deleted from existence. They broke and ran, streaming back toward French lines. And here's where it gets insane. The Count d'Ansong, seeing the Genoese retreating, shouted, Kill me this rabble that blocks our way. The French knights charged into their own crossbowmen, trampling and cutting them down. They literally murdered their own mercenaries for the crime of not dying fast enough. The Genoese were caught between English arrows and French swords. Those who survived fled the field entirely, cursing their employers. Now came the main French assault. 12,000 mounted knights charging uphill through mud over the bodies of dead Genoese into the teeth of English arrows. This is where we need to talk about what a longbow arrow actually did to armor. At long range, arrows might not penetrate good plate armor, but they didn't need to. They hit horses, which even when armored had vulnerable spots, eyes, mouths, legs. Horse in 500 Lelbeat horse hit by multiple arrows doesn't charge. It screams, rears, falls, creating a 1/500 Doddelby obstacle. Knights behind crashed into fallen horses. The charge lost all momentum. At closer range, under 100 yards, long bow arrows with bodkin points could punch through mail and even plate armor at weak points. They went through visors into faces, through joints into armpits, through mail into thighs. But even non-penetrating hits were devastating. The impact of an arrow hitting plate armor was like being hit with a hammer. Multiple hits rattled knights inside their armor like dice in a cup. The French came in waves, each one climbing over the dead of the previous charge. The English archers had pre-supplied arrows stuck in the ground in front of them for quick access. They kept up continuous fire. Contemporary accounts describe arrows falling like snow, so thick that charging knights couldn't see through them. But it wasn't just arrows. The battlefield Edward had prepared now showed its worth. Horses hit the hidden ditches and broke legs. Knights crashed into sharpened stakes. The mud from the earlier rain turned into a slippery hell. Dismounted knights in 60 lb of armor could barely move. They became stationary targets. And here's the detail that perfectly captures the horror. English archers ran out of arrows several times. You know what they did. They ran forward into the field, pulled arrows out of dead and dying French knights, and fired them back. The French were being killed with their own recycled suffering. The blind King John of Bohemia now enters our story with the most insanely noble death in medieval history. John had been blind for a decade, but came to fight anyway. When he heard the battle was lost, he allegedly said, "The King of Bohemia does not flee from a battle." He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his so they could lead him into combat. He wanted to strike at least one blow with his sword before dying. This blind 50-year-old king charged directly into the English lines, swinging his sword at sounds and shadows. He and all his attached knights were killed immediately. When they found his body, he was still tied to his dead companions, his blind eyes open, his sword in his hand. He'd achieved his wish. He'd struck an enemy before dying. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was so moved by this display of courage that he took John's personal emblem, ostrich feathers with the motto, "Ecton I serve," which remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales today. As the sun set, the French had charged 16 times, 16 separate waves of nobility throwing themselves into the meat grinder. Each charge was less organized than the last. French nobles were literally fighting each other to get to the front, to have their chance at glory, only to die in the mud like all the others. Philip VI himself charged with the final wave. His horse was killed under him. An arrow went through his jaw. His personal guard had to physically drag him from the field as he tried to return to the battle. The sacred oriflamme, the battle banner of France that supposedly guaranteed victory, was abandoned in the mud. As darkness fell, the English couldn't believe they'd won. They stayed in position all night, killing any wounded French who moved. They'd run out of arrows multiple times and had resorted to using knives, hammers, and stakes to finish off dismounted knights. English peasant archers were literally beating French nobles to death with sticks. When dawn came on August 27th, the scale of the slaughter became clear. The cream of French nobility lay dead in the mud. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blahier, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Augeer, the Count of Sancerre. The list went on and on. 2,500 nobles dead. 11 princes, thousands of lesser knights. The Genoese who hadn't fled were all dead, many killed by their own employers. The English losses, about 40 dead, including only 2 knights. 1 English knight versus 750 French nobles. The disparity was so extreme that contemporary chroniclers didn't believe it. Some claimed divine intervention. But the reality was simpler. The longbow had made heavy cavalry obsolete in a single afternoon. But here's the truly devastating part. It wasn't just the deaths, it was who died. Medieval warfare usually involved capturing nobles for ransom. It was a gentleman's agreement. You didn't kill people worth money. But at Crecy, the English archers, common men with no understanding of or care for chivalric codes, simply killed everyone. They put arrows through the faces of dukes and counts without knowing or caring who they were. The psychological impact on European nobility was shattering. For 500 years, being a knight meant being militarily superior. Your noble blood, blessed by God, made you better at war than commoners. Crecy proved that a Welsh peasant with a stick could kill you just as dead as another knight. That military superiority didn't come from blood, but from technology and tactics. The entire social order of medieval Europe was challenged. The aftermath was grotesque. So many nobles died that there weren't enough people of appropriate rank to bury them properly. Bodies lay rotting for days. Crows and wolves feasted on princely flesh. Local peasants looted noble corpses, finding enough wealth to transform their lives. The armor that couldn't save its wearers was melted down and sold. The English army, exhausted and shocked by their own victory, continued their march to Calais. They left behind a field so thick with noble corpses that locals renamed it the Field of the Cloth of Gold, for all the expensive clothing on the dead. For years afterward, farmers plowing the field would turn up noble bones and rusted armor. France went into shock. The loss of so many nobles in one day created a power vacuum. Entire regions lost their lords. Administrative systems collapsed. The French military had to be completely restructured. They started hiring more crossbowmen, building their own archer corps, and most humiliatingly, copying English tactics of fighting on foot. The battle also created a new kind of warfare. The dominance of the longbow meant battles became longer-range affairs. The age of glorious cavalry charges was over. Wars became about positioning, preparation, and firepower rather than courage and swordplay. The romance of medieval combat died in the mud at Crecy. But France didn't learn immediately. 10 years later at Poitiers, they did the exact same thing. Charged English archers positioned on a hill with the exact same result. They lost another king and thousands more nobles. It took the French nearly a century to fully adapt to the new reality that common archers were more valuable than noble knights. The social implications were even more profound. If peasant archers could destroy noble knights, what did that say about the divine right of nobility? If common Welsh criminals could kill princes, what justified the feudal system? Crecy didn't just kill French nobles. It killed the idea that noble blood meant military superiority. The English longbowmen became the most feared troops in Europe. But here's the ironic part. The longbow's dominance was temporary. It required a lifetime of training to use effectively. You couldn't create longbowmen quickly. When gunpowder weapons arrived, which any peasant could learn to use in a day, the longbow became obsolete too. The weapon that killed chivalry was itself killed by progress. The blind king of Bohemia became a legend. His suicidal charge was seen as the last pure expression of chivalric honor, choosing certain death over retreat, wanting to strike one blow for glory even in blindness. His death represented the end of an era when nobility meant something beyond wealth, when honor mattered more than survival. Modern military historians study Crecy as a revolution in warfare. It proved that technology and tactics trumped numbers and courage, that prepared defensive positions beat charging cavalry, that disciplined firepower beats individual combat skills. Every modern military principle was demonstrated in that muddy field in 1346. But the most lasting image from Crecy is this. French knights, the proud nobility of the greatest kingdom in Christendom, trampling their own allies to death in their rush to die gloriously, while English peasants calmly shot them down like target practice. The Count d'Alençon, who ordered the massacre of his own Genoese crossbowmen, was himself shot through the face with an arrow moments later. The French literally killed more of their own men than the English killed Englishmen. The crows that feasted on noble corpses became so fat on princely flesh that locals reported they could barely fly. They would hop from corpse to corpse, too bloated to take wing. It was the perfect metaphor. Even the scavengers were overwhelmed by the death of so much nobility. Today, a small monument marks the field at Crecy. Tour buses rarely stop. Most people have never heard of it. But on August 26, 1346, on that muddy slope, the medieval world ended. 500 years of military tradition, the entire concept of warrior nobility, the romance of knightly combat. All of it died in an afternoon, killed by commoners with bent sticks and string. The English didn't just win a battle at Crecy. They proved that courage couldn't beat mathematics, that nobility couldn't stop arrows, and that the age of the knight was ending. The French lost more than nobles that day. They lost their entire understanding of how the world worked. And all it took was 5,000 peasants who practiced archery every Sunday after church.